So thank you for the opportunity to come back and start the first of a couple of workshops around the investment CCTO and the process that I guess we're going through to try and make sure that we set everything up. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah. It's a public workshop, so it's...
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess in terms of today, one of the key pieces we're trying to work through is work through and establish, I guess, what we'll call the foundation steps. So the principles, the purpose, the values. And the reason that we want to do this is that ultimately when we set a CCTO up, you guys need to exactly understand what its purpose is and what it's doing and what it's not. And it's also important for the CCTO themselves to actually understand what their role is exactly and what their role isn't. So today's all about that purpose, and ultimately where we're trying to get to out of this is council sets for organisations like CCOs statement of expectations. So today, think about this as a precursor to a statement of expectations. You know, what are your expectations of what the CCTO should do? We'll have a session in a couple of weeks' time, which is around how do we actually find the right people and what do those people look like and how does those skill sets work and how does that interaction take place. But today is about thinking about the expectations that we have. But as part of today, we'll actually do a little bit of a recap in terms of the journey, in terms of where we've got to, look a little bit around the consultation process as well, because some of those things, again, if you look at what was in the consultation process, ultimately end up being part of your expectations. And ultimately what we're trying to get to is the Local Government Act in Section 64B is a draft statement of expectations. So that's the first kind of step that we're looking at in terms of this. So our agenda today, we will look backwards a little bit first, the journey that we've been on. We'll look a little bit about the economic environment as well, just so that we can kind of understand the context that we're playing in. We'll look at the commercial assets that we have, the expectations that we've set, some of the feedback we got out of our consultation, the timeframes we're working towards, and then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion, which is the interactive piece, which is around what are the expectations that you want to set so that we can then take that away and then in 6 weeks' time or thereabouts come back with a draft statement of expectations. So this is what it potentially could look like. I guess when we do a lot of these things, it's often about the 5 big questions: who, why, what, when, how. And this is no different. So the who we'll discuss next time, which is around how do we get the right people. The when, so this is around the timing of the timetable of creation of this, so we will talk through that. This is the precursor to some of that process. The what, so that's looking at the actual assets themselves. We'll have a little discussion on that, but again, we'll talk about the process to bring those up to council. The why, so this is, I guess, what today is about, is the why. This is the what are we trying to achieve, how are we going to try and achieve it, and the how is then about the delegation. So each of those will come either through a workshop and then up to council, and it's the same with the assets. I'll go through that process as well.
Just to chip in there this morning, Scott, it was discussed really to have the more detailed work program come forward at some stage.
Okay.
My answer to that was that we would be seeing how we come from this one, and probably at the next one be able to have that more detailed detailed work program, because then we know really if there's any places that we need to dive further into from this one around the purpose and those sorts of things.
Okay, so that's an easy add-in for next time. I guess just going back a little bit about the economics in terms of where we are. I don't think I need to teach you that these are a little bit of a challenging time for certain parts of the economy. This is the Westpac data. Probably the key pieces to note, and I guess a lot of the assets, the investment assets the council has, are land-based assets. If you look at some of this data, sorry, I'll stand up. House prices index is pretty flat, but they are forecasting it in the next couple of years to start rising again. So I guess that's that kind of bubble. Why? Pretty much because interest rates are forecast to fall. So I think even the inflation data the other day shows that inflation's starting to come under control. People are starting to expect the Reserve Bank will start to lower interest rates. That lowering of interest rates will start to stir the housing market again. The challenge for you in terms of the portfolio of assets that sit there today is a lot of them are land-based assets. This one here is a very complicated slide, and from the distance that you're at, you won't be able to see anything, but I will talk to it. This is from Mercer's. They put this out each year. It's what they call their periodic table of investment returns. What it highlights, so these are all different asset classes. Property is the light green one, so at the moment property is a bit flat, in fact it's negative in terms of its returns. But property has been really, really good when interest rates have been low. But of course, I guess the thing we can learn is that when property is down, other sectors actually do really, really well. And ultimately, if we think about where we're trying to take council to, then we're trying to get you to have a little bit of everything so that we're not so reliant on just one thing going well all the time. And ultimately, that will help council to achieve that overall purpose, which we'll discuss today, of how do we actually just grow the portfolio over time.
Just to add to that one, the transition from heavily based land, investments into a more diverse portfolio, that does take time, and it's obviously not going to, if you're in a relatively flat market in the initial years, it's going to be a little bit bumpy in terms of that return as well. So just to keep that in perspective, that even if you're doing everything you can to get good returns out of your land, it's going to be less than when interest rates are low, basically.
So the other one that's probably also relevant is that the white one on here is cash. So putting your money in the bank tends to probably be, over the long term, yes, it's relatively stable and safe, but it's also probably one of your worst returns. And I guess that concept you guys have at the moment of a lot of internal loans means that the assets that we've potentially sold in the past and sat as reserves have internally lent, and we haven't really got a decent return out of how we've looked after them. So there are some kind of behavioural challenges and changes that we'll need to look at in order to try and get us to where we want to get to. This last data is courtesy of JB Ware. This is American-based, and it goes back over 70 years, which is probably longer than most of us have owned a house. What it does highlight is that, again, the housing price index has kind of gone up and up and up, which is the red line. Other listed markets have performed better. This inflation is in the middle somewhere. And the green one is based on the other side. So for those that had houses in the 80s, or as my parents tell me, we're used to paying 15, 20%. Yeah. We haven't seen that for a long, long time. And actually, if you look at this, interest rates fell for effectively 35 years slowly. They've only just started to come back up again. So everyone's kind of new in this environment of interest rates rising as well over the last couple of years. And house prices obviously have a correlation in terms of that interest rate return.
I did.
You remember it?
I had a mortgage at 17.5%, 18%.
There we go. So, and in those years,
My parents had.
yep,
My first mortgage was at the peak.
Yeah.
there we go. So I guess in terms of setting the scene, whoops, we've gone on too far again. I've kind of used this Google Maps piece, and we used it the first time we talked to you as well. We've kind of worked out where we want to go. So we've said, yes, we want to try and look after our investment assets in a different way. So that's kind of given us a destination. That's what we want to try and achieve. How we get there is, we've kind of done through the consultation process and a little bit about today as well. So if you looked, for example, if you were sitting down, not here at McLean Park, because I was assuming I was going to be down at the War Memorial, but if I was at the War Memorial and I put in the airport, it actually gives me 3 different directions that I can go, right? The shortest direction in terms of distance isn't actually the quickest direction, and sometimes you actually have to choose what you want to see on the way, in which direction. And it's a little bit about today. This is about, yes, we know we want a CCTO, we know we want to manage our assets better, but what is the purpose? What are the rules we want to put around the outside? What do we want to see on the way? What are our expectations of the CCTO? So that's really about, yes, you can go the quickest way to get there, but actually this is the opportunity to determine what part of that journey is. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to go to this slide first, actually. So in terms of our commercial assets, we used a bunch of commercial assets when we talked to you pre the consultation process in terms of, so what we've done is we've identified some asset classes that we could put into the CCTO. We're not looking to put everything in at once because there's an awful lot of work in some cases to get some of those assets ready. What we will do today is we will discuss with you what we went through with the leadership team, and they identified as potentially the first targets. We will get a view from you today in terms of whether you think those are fair and reasonable. And the reason we want to do that is it's really hard to try and upset the objectives of the CCTO if you don't know what type of assets they're looking after. So we've got to have a little bit of an indicator to start with. We'll then go through the process of separation. So that's basically, okay, if they're currently managed by council today, how do we get them so they can be managed by a CCTO tomorrow? We'll put some interim management and objectives over the top of it. We'll define the delegations that we need from the council in order for the CCTO to be able to look after them. And then we'll bring them back to council for approval to effectively move those assets across. So there is a process that we're looking at around, and you have to think of that as each individual asset, because some assets are quite easy to separate, some assets, as we've discussed even with the leadership team, are actually reasonably complicated. And when we go through that process, we're asking ourselves a whole lot of questions. You know, council obligation is this a core obligation of council? If it is, it kind of isn't something that you really want to be taking away, because council should be doing it. You know, I guess in terms of what do we do first, what's the size of the prize? What bang for buck do we get out of some of these things? Because in some cases you can put an awful lot of work in and you only move the needle just a little bit. We're not saying we won't look at those, but maybe they're not the ones you look at first. How simple is the delegation to get from council? What asset principles or what things do we need to ring fence inside that? Are there any policies that we need to have consideration around? From a team, how easy is it to separate the operations from the strategy? Because ultimately the CCO is looking around the strategy of these assets and how we manage them. Are there any fishhooks? Councils always seem to have fishhooks, so we want to try and understand those early. How well are we documented? How quickly can we get to the transition point? Is there someone ready at the CCTO to actually receive it? You know, all of those things, like today, there's no one there to receive it, so let's not push it tomorrow. But these are all the questions that we're asking.
When you say fishhooks,
Yes.
can you expand on that?
So, look, I mean, a nice simple one is like an airport, we know we can't sell because it's a strategic asset. But if we looked at something like leasehold property as a portfolio, there may be certain property assets in there that council has a certain design on for a certain reason that we need to actually make sure that we identify so that we don't hand it over and then they try and move on asset A and council's going, whoa, hang on a second, we're happy with all the others, but we forgot to mention that asset A has significance for whatever reason. So it's just, look.
So that's really about letter of intent, isn't it?
It is
It's also a process of consideration from the council as to what values they have for a particular thing. And I'll give you an example of something that on the face of it seems easy, but that's the Piramai education land. But if you think about it, you know, so you think, okay, well, that looks pretty straightforward. It's zoned residential. It hasn't got a designated use for it. But we do know that there is a community around that, and there are expectations from that. That really needs a conscious decision of release from you as councillors to know that once it goes into the CCTO, they may do something to sell that or may not. Their objective is not necessarily to please the neighbours. They don't want to upset them, but they don't want to please them necessarily. Their objectives will be to make the best return for council to offset, you know, those social agendas a different way. So, yeah, even the most simple ones are not so simple, and it's about conscious decision-making to make sure that you're putting the right assets, particularly at the beginning of the process. You can always build complexity once you build that confidence and trust in the CCTO and the council moving forward. But at the beginning, it's easier if it's very tight around, you know that it's really solely there for economic or commercial gain.
Thank you.
So, again, sorry, difficult to see here, but we went through a discussion with the leadership team probably a month ago, Jess, and looked at, I guess, 10 types of assets that we saw that had potential from within the portfolio of council. And I'll stand and talk to these. So the ones that were highlighted in green are the ones which the leadership team think are potentially the first cabs off the rank. And we say the first cabs off the rank, so these are ones that we want to try and move within, I guess, the first financial year of the long-term plan. So they are land development, parklands, you know, reasonable size asset, significant changes in terms of what benefit could be derived by council out of that process. A little bit of operational complexity, you know, so we've got to work through some of those things. Fair residential zoned land, you know, relatively small in terms of asset size, but actually has some quite, and Spirimai is an example of that. You know, so there are a couple of blocks that potentially we'd need to look at and say, well, look, they are residentially zoned, sitting there being mown. And so therefore, you know, is there development potential for those to sit effectively alongside parklands and to realise some capital for council out of that process? The next one is, again, asset size relatively small, high benefit. This is bare land blocks, but where you'll need a zone change. In other words, council's got a whole lot of land assets that sit there at the moment, whether they be in, we'll use an example, around the back of Awatoto, you've got an awful lot of land that could be industrial subdivision. At the moment, you know, it sits there under wastewater designation. Is it going to be used for that purpose or is it not? That's not a one-step decision. That's a complex process of plan change and other bits and pieces that need to be considered. But again, how do we open value up? That's not one that we're looking to do as an early one. But look, it's just, we need to sit there and think about some of the assets that we have if we want to try and unlock some value and go, okay, is that needed for that purpose? So that's not a today question, that's a future question. Leasehold property as a portfolio, yep, high asset value, but your ability to tweak the operating revenue on that is actually relatively light because it's based on a legal document that says the leases change this much each year. The questions then become around, okay, so do we sell some of those blocks? Do we buy the lessees out? Do we develop? Do we, you know, what are our other options? Those, you know, McLean Park rentals, so I guess the houses that sit around the back here, I know you've had a discussion on McLean Park and that will have to come into that process as well. Shares in the airport and managed funds. Now, managed funds are on there with a low dollar value because at the moment we have none. But we should be looking to, if we do have some, how do we put them in there? What are some of the responsible investment kind of principles that we want to try and see? So that's, and how do we build that up so that they're ready to go? The other ones that are here, commercial tourism assets, kind of hard in terms of the operational complexity because of the way they're so intertwined into council at the moment. And so we've just got to try and look at how do we put advice into the strategy on those, but maybe we're not trying to take those out on day one. And again, look, this list is for council to come back and say, can you consider putting that in? Can you consider taking that out, as the case may be? So this is really where today, but a lot of it we've just got to think of, here's a set of assets. When we have the discussion around the purpose and the principles and all those other things, do it with these assets in mind, because at least it helps us to kind of formulate principles on which we're going forward. Reimagine tourism assets, even harder. Social housing sales, if there is any, but again, the income's not necessarily looking to come into the CCTO. So future opportunities. So future opportunities is around things that council doesn't do today. Right, so they're not really council assets, they're a CCTO opportunity, and that might be, how do we partnership with Manuahariri on land development? How do we do some of those other things where we start to utilise the skill sets that the CCTO develops and the capital that gets released as we start to move some of these other bits and pieces around, and how do we then start to grow the local benefit, if you like, of what the CCTO is doing. So that's the starter, and we'll come back to this slide at the finish. But I guess what we're doing at this stage is just putting that out there and saying, look, here's a set of assets. This is what the leadership team's determined as the ones that they think are easier to, are more able to be moved in this financial year, once we set everything up. But we'll have another discussion at the finish and say, look, is there any other assets you want us to think about and bring back? Sally?
Sorry, thank you. The numbers that we used in the LTP,
Yep.
were they based on this group of green assets?
They are largely based on that group of green assets, yes. So
So the total-
particularly the leasehold, the top two, and yeah, no, they are basically based on that similar group.
The number that we put, I think, was 160 million or something like that. So that's the kind of total value of those.
Yeah, so the leasehold property is about $100 million in its own right. Your airport shares are about 15, your Ben land development's around 25 or 30. There's probably $5 million in your residential zones. You know, so it's a combination of all of those roughly.
I don't think we'd considered airport shares, the Hawke's Bay airport shares as part of
Part
our
of
numbers
that.
in terms of the consultation, but we haven't forecast a
Yeah.
dividend return from them anyway,
Yeah.
so any income would be upside.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Maxine?
If we were to consider building, say, more pensioner flats on some of the land that's available,
Mm-hmm.
would the CCTO be in charge of that as a project? Would it be
So I think when your statement of intent, if your purpose is to generate a fund over time, which I'm assuming that would be still the core purpose, is this intergenerational fund, then it's not there to manage projects, it's there to generate a fund, you know, almost separate from council business that it can plug back into offset rates. So I guess the only way that would happen is if there was a commercial benefit for the CCTO before it went back to council. You know what I mean?
like if they sold it to someone else to build?
Well, and again, when we go through the purpose, I think today, there's a question around if you have these skills sitting just outside council in the CCTO, how do you want them to interface back into council? So that's one of the questions that we'll look at is how does that relationship work? And actually, do you want them to be an advisor to council to support some of these other things? Admittedly, they've got to focus on their core role, but I know that in my previous environment, there were projects that council did where I got brought in just to try and give some support and advice around the commercials of how do you make it better.
Did they listen?
In many cases, yes. In most cases, actually. So this probably comes back to, I think, the question that Sally just asked, you know, in terms of the long-term plan, what did we have in there? Well, we had a set of assets which is probably very similar to where we are. It's probably just worth noting the piece in red, you know, the income that's actually sitting in the long-term plan, about 60% of your income comes out of development and about 40% comes out of what I've termed annuities. So in other words, things like just rental and other things which are just pretty much just flowing every year. You know, so you are quite cyclical in terms of where your income comes. And I guess even within that, while land might not be selling like hotcakes today, part of the process that we're looking at is how do we manage the cost? How do we manage the cost? Because ultimately, the return that you make out of things like parklands is the cash component is at the tail end of the process. But if we're spending twice as much money as every other developer to get it there, then we're not doing the job properly. You know, so, and I'm not saying that we're spending twice as much, but you know, that's just as an example. And so therefore, around cost management is a critical piece of particularly development, because it is, you make your money actually up front before the money actually comes in, because it's all in the process. It's all in the early part of the process. I guess on the consultation piece as well, this was straight out of your document, so I don't need to tell you what it said, but you highlighted your long-term appetite and an intergenerational investment and diversifying, lowering your risk. And if you think of it at the moment, you have a very, very high concentration risk into property. You have a very, very high concentration risk in Napier. How do we make sure that we earn our income from different places and different sources? And then in terms of the recommendations, there were a set of recommendations that came through in terms of establishing the process for the CCTO, thus the workshop that we're having today. But there are other messages that came through in the consultation as well. Clear identification of social outcomes. So for me, that's around things like, are our values aligned? And again, this is where a statement of expectations is important. Clear definitions around responsible investment. So I've got the SIPO there, which is a document that's normally associated with managed funds, a statement of investment performance and objectives. And the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment is something that often people use, but a lot of it is just around what are the principles that you actually want to see applying there. Other comments, play to our strength, best use of what we have. How do we ensure accountability back to our local members? So that is a critical piece, and again, that is around expectations, but today we'll talk about relationship. So what is the relationship that we want the CCTO to have with ourselves? How does that work?
Does this need to fit in with our strategic priorities?
Yes, it will be part of your strategic priorities, but it might be only a part of your strategic priorities. Because again, and we'll have this discussion today, what is the objective of the CCTO? Is it to deliver all your social objectives, or is it to maximise the commercial return so that you can do your social objectives? But again, you want to make sure that the values are aligned. Because in other organisations, I've always said the front page test is the best test to make sure you've actually got things right. A CCTO does not want to embarrass the council, and the CCTO doesn't want to embarrass itself. And we need to demonstrate a change in outcome. So, in other words, we want to actually make sure that we make a step change out of doing this. So where are we in terms of what are the timetable that we're looking at? And I think based off the comment that Richard just made earlier, we'll bring this back into the next meeting in a more fulsome degree. We've completed the consultation. The objective of the next couple of workshops is to create a draft statement of an expectation and a draft appointment policy so that we know how we get the right people. We'd look at legal establishment towards the end of this financial year, or end of this calendar year. So these are calendar years as opposed to financial years. That would then allow independent director appointments maybe at the end of this year or starting very early next, because it will take time to get this going. They'd get their first resource potentially into early next year, and then we'd look at the first tranche of assets by 30 June to try and align with that. So there is a series of kind of getting everything ready so that we can hand things over. So that's at a very, very high level. What are we trying to get to? Okay, now we get to the interactive piece. Our expectations. So for those that don't know, a statement of expectations is actually set out in the Local Government Act, Section 64B, for those that like the detail. And it specifies how the relationship and the conduct between the two organisations exist. It talks about how the expectations in terms of relationship with external parties, particularly Māori and others as well, and what we have there. And I guess in the case of ourselves, may include other shareholder expectations, such as relationship with the community or returns or delivery of services, etc. So depending on the nature of what your CCO is set up to do, you will have certain expectations in there that the other key piece is a statement of expectations is actually as a council document. So a statement of intent is a document of a CCTO or a CCTO, that's their response back as a draft and then as a final with council putting feedback. But think of it this way, a statement of expectations is you're sitting there and saying, this is what we'd like you to do. They come back and say, this is what we think we can do. You go back and go, yeah, we'd like you, that's great, but we'd like you to think a little bit more about this, and then they come back with a final. I mean, it's a multiple step process, but particularly when we establish a CCTO, the statement of expectations is actually really, really important. Because while in a couple of weeks' time we'll talk about how we get the people, if you think of what a position description for this is going to look like, your statement of expectations is actually, in one sense, almost like your position description, because they sit there and go, okay, what are we set up? What are we here to do? Okay, the statement of expectations lays that out. So today is very much around getting the feedback from yourselves so that the leadership team can go away and create that draft based off the input that we get back today.
What's the difference between a statement of expectation and a statement of intent?
So a statement of expectations is council's expectation out.
Okay.
Okay. The statement of intent is effectively the CCO or CCTO's response back. So they say, our intent is to do this. We expect you to do this. Our intent is to do that. That's the draft. And then the council goes back and go, yeah, that's great, but we'd like you to do a little bit more. So that's a response to the statement of intent. And then there's a final statement of intent. So that statement of intent comes from the CCTO back to council. Statement of expectation goes from council to saying this is what we want you to do. And they have to fit, right? And they have a process in the Local Government Act in terms of timing. So, you know, you'd normally produce a statement of expectations probably by Christmas would be the standard. The draft comes back at the end of February, council responds by the end of April, and then the final is back by 30 June. So that's the timing that it works. So again, this is why this document for you is really, really important, because this is the framework that you want in terms of the behaviours and the expectations.
While we've got to set the objectives, are there any exemplar out there that provide guidance as to what we could have in our...
Yeah, there are, and we'll go through some of those. So in a lot of cases, what we're going to try and do is say, look, here's some examples. And in fact, HBRIC, you know, recently set an upgraded expectations for, council recently set an updated expectations for HBRIC, get it the right way around. And there are other examples, multiple examples around the country of these being established.
Because you're quite land-based in terms of your assets, you will need to reflect that, you know, that kind of in against what others are, because they're all a bit different, aren't they? Like, say our one, we've got a particularly strong asset base and land, so that would need to come through in terms of your statement of expectation as well. What assets you put in there, basically.
So this is the last talk to slide, and then we're basically into open discussion. But in prior workshops, we put this up as an example. And this was, I guess, around purpose. And the question for council today is ultimately, is this the basis on which we want to start and carry on? So we talked about an intergenerational investment portfolio or an endowment type portfolio, and the objectives there to provide equitable commercial returns through cash distribution to council, both for today and tomorrow's ratepayers. So in other words, to provide council with an income stream. To preserve the capital value over time, to grow it with inflation for today and tomorrow's ratepayers, so that it's not just about how do we spend today and then we don't have anything for tomorrow. To make sure that it's aligned to council's visions and values. To hold the right mix of regional, and I'll use regional, territorial and financial assets to achieve those objectives. And to ensure that they have the right resources to do that. Now those are a base that ultimately we put out there previously. As a starting question, is there anybody that has any other or any questions on some of those in terms of whether they are genuinely what? We will touch on it as we go through, but it's just as a Okay. Yeah.
Scott, sorry, just reading. Grows with inflation
Yes?
doesn't sound particularly ambitious.
No. You could argue that it's not ambitious. I guess if we think of, and so this comes right back to the core expectation of purpose here. You can have a money tree, which you shake every year, and all the fruit comes off, and you consume all the fruit. In other words, you take all the income that it gets, and you leave nothing behind. And ultimately, all you've ever got is one tree, right? So you can have another scenario where basically all the fruit that goes off the tree you go out and replant somewhere else, and so therefore you end up with a whole grove of trees, but you never feed the family because you haven't given them any money. So I guess what we're using here is inflation proofing as a minimum objective, just to sit there so that tomorrow's ratepayers, the value of the asset that they have sitting there to earn them income is at least the equivalent of what it is today, because the inflation recognises that change. Yes, there are things like we want to grow resilience, we want the portfolio to be bigger than inflation proofing over time. That becomes a council decision, because ultimately these things earn inflation proof value, they should earn an income stream for council, and they probably earn a little slice of extra which will grow resilience. Or council might sit there and go, we need that every time, in which case you don't grow resilience. So there's again, that becomes part of what do you want this to achieve? There's a minimum, I think, that you need in order to keep feeding council every year, and you want to make sure that that minimum doesn't take away the asset of the future by consuming too much. You may decide to consume less and leave more in there so that it can grow and grow and grow for tomorrow's generations too, or that it has a third objective of growing resilience.
So is that what you're asking us now?
That will be part of what this is today, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So defining role now, apologies, it looks like an Irish flag, it wasn't intended to. So the primary role, so an example, the primary role of, insert CCTO here, is to maximise the commercial benefit for council and thereby the region or the territory via a constantly growing cash income stream to council while council retains its primary goal of serving the community. So that is an example of a statement that we could use, and I'll just highlight the next piece underneath it as well. In order to do that, you might sit there and say that the objective of the CCTO is to generate a positive commercial return, but it might be neutral on your other well-beings, economic well-beings, cultural well-beings, social environment, social. And the question for you is that what you want it to do? What if it generated a negative outcome on one of those? What if it generated multiple positive? What is the objective that you want, as a bare minimum, your CCTO to achieve? And I'm going to leave that open in terms of a starting point, if that's okay.
I certainly don't think we'd want any negative
Yep.
as a starting point.
Yep.
So would neutral or better would be a better term, wouldn't it? Neutral or better for all the other aspects, I think, would be a good starting point.
But that's fine.
Is this a question that if we ask it to be positive, for instance, and like my initial reaction is the top two need to be positive, the remaining three need to be neutral, because if you put too much pressure on it to be positive in all of those other areas, you're inherently reducing the purpose of the commercial return.
Yeah, and in theory, you could have left it in council on that basis.
Yeah.
But it's still a public body, and so you don't want to achieve, like Mayor said, any of those negative outcomes, but...
So how would you assess whether what's being done is positive, neutral or negative when you get into cultural, environmental and social? How would that be?
I guess in a council context, you do objectives and you sit there and you talk about how they achieve your certain well-beings. If you looked at and and if I take leasehold, I'll take parklands as an example. So if you sat there and looked at parklands, you can develop parklands to get a commercial return, tick. You can grow the economic, your largest benefit is actually just through the sale and development of the land, but there are other economic things that come through there. But you could make it absolutely positive on the environmental side and the social side, but actually it'll be at the cost of your ability to generate a return, because you put more playgrounds in it, or you put more, you put more trees and have wider berms and all those other lovely things which make it look fantastic, but actually the return that you've generated has now gone smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now that means that it's achieved all of the objectives on that side, and it's ultimately, they would then be able to sit there and go, look, we've ticked boxes A, B, C and D. But if you sat there and said to them, actually our objective for you is to maximise the commercial return out of parklands within obviously the requirements of the law and the district plan, so you're not getting a negative externality there, and to give council a return as a result of that and diversify the asset pool and all the rest of it, then maybe that's enough.
So that's a very real example. So currently, the way we manage parklands, no judgment here, but we do it as an exemplar in some respects in terms of its sustainability, environmental performance. And the problem with that is that the district plan sets a limit where you know where you've achieved it or not, and then you can cost that. But if you have an open-ended kind of view of what excellence looks like, where does that begin and end? It's not actually written in black and white as a standard, and you end up spending more money than perhaps you should be if you're just commercially focused.
Right, so that's what we are currently doing.
There are elements of that, yes. Yeah, and I think that's because it's the objectives are a little bit mixed in terms of are we trying to produce a great suburb in Parklands,
Yeah.
which is a good ambition, but it's not if it's your commercial asset. Yeah. You definitely don't want to, as Scott said, go below the district plan. That's a big no. But that district plan we would see as the neutral, compliance with the district plan is a neutral approach to the environmental standard. Yeah.
Ellie?
I think in terms of investment and stuff, there's some pretty industry standards out there, isn't there, in terms of social return on investment and where you sort of sit.
Yes.
Is it possible for us to sort of look at it through that scale?
So there is a slide coming up on exactly that, which is around, that's kind of around the behaviours of where you invest in the social behaviour that sits there.
Yeah, okay. Which would then be the way that you would implement this, is that the idea?
Yeah, so I guess one of the questions that, just to reframe this slightly differently, that last sentence for me is really, really important. Council retains the primary objective of serving the community. So if I look at the CCTOs that I've run in the past and worked with, the objective of them is to make a commercial return, to not embarrass the council, so no negatives, right? So there's a set of rules, we want you to make sure there are no negatives, but is to work within the district plan or within the framework that is provided to maximise the commercial return, and that is demonstrated through a distribution to the council, and it's demonstrated through a growth in the underlying asset portfolio. The council objective then is to take the money and to do a lot of these other things, because that's what council does. However, I have also sat there and said, Scott, while your commercial objective is, or your primary objective is to make money, we do value the fact that if you can do some of these other things at the same time without actually giving much away, then that's what we want you to do as well. We want you to note and record those things, because what I've seen in examples with other CCTOs is where you generate your commercial return and you can demonstrate some social benefit or some cultural benefit through partnership with Māori or whatever it happens to be, those are the real wins, right? But you're still doing it for one objective first, which is to achieve a commercial return, because if it's not achieving a commercial return, why have it in a commercial CCTO?
Is it something along the lines of a principle where we will take on all sort of value add opportunities whilst making sure that
Yep.
commercial return is safeguarded?
Yep, so we can note that council values, all other well-beings that are able to be enhanced. But we note the principal objective is to achieve a commercial return.
Commercial return, it's got to be.
Yes.
Otherwise, what's the point? Yeah.
Oh, exactly, but again, the reason we're asking this is sometimes people sit there and go, oh yeah, but you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And it's like, well, actually, if you're doing all of those things, then you're not actually trying to achieve the commercial. And this is important if we think of what we're trying to create here is we're creating a statement of expectations, but we're also creating a position description for a potential independent director. They want to know what their objective is. Their objective is to maximise a return for council through commercial behaviour. But we also know that their objective is to make sure that in doing that, they don't embarrass the council by bringing some of these negative externalities, because that's not acceptable to you.
Part of that is also separating who's really responsible for delivering those other well-beings. In other words, if we have enabled the organisation to get on and create a commercial return, and they've provided us a dividend, then that enables us as the council
To do the other.
to identify those other social and economic well-beings and actively engage in those areas. And so both purposes have been solved.
And I think in the release of the asset to the CCTO, you need, before you do that, you need to, even for that specific asset, have gone through those other elements that you would normally do in particular to make sure that you've satisfied those concerns before you put it over there.
Okay. So the question there at the bottom is your CCTO constrained to Napier? Now, I'm going to exclude things like if you have managed funds,
Yeah.
right? They're obviously going to be international or whatever that happens to be. But if they find a land development opportunity next door or a commercial transaction which they can do, which is just on the fringe of Napier or maybe it's somewhere else, and this doesn't need to be, these are things that can change over time, don't get me wrong, but it's a question of are you...
How long does your statement of expectation stand for?
You can review it every year.
That's what I thought. Okay, so you have the wriggle room there, because when I read that, my first thought is about PSGEs, mana whenua, the potential for us to partner, or for the CCTO to partner with them on developments, etc.
Yep.
Some of that land sits outside of our city limits because of the natural takiwa boundaries and things like that. So, in my mind, I don't think we should, even from the start, to encourage those kind of discussions to happen. I think it would be too limited.
Yep.
But that's just my thought.
I mean, I go even further. I think if your primary goal was around commercial return, then no, we should not be constrained by our city limits, because there may be far better opportunities outside of our city limits. So why would we constrain ourselves?
Would it, just to pose the question, would it cause an issue for you if there was a project in Hastings that was quite visible that Napier was then investing in?
As long as it's commercial.
Partnering.
Yeah, I think it's the optics of it,
That's right.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that would be the consideration we'd have to take. But I think if it's a partnering,
We're doing that now
with the
with the MCG storage facility.
Why would you not buy a commercial building in Auckland?
I'm
Yeah.
posing the question.
Yeah.
Devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But part of it also is about diversifying the risk, isn't it? So all our eggs aren't in the one basket if it turns to custard.
Exactly.
And it's not like we have,
Financial
I
advice
don't
on the
think it's
card,
constrained by you.
There was a reason that
Voting
he said,
against
damn
the
it, I'm staying. There's a reason.
Yeah, who voted against it?
Well, it's because you're obviously not fully aware of what's going on.
And if I could
You better do a
suggest
talking
that
point,
it's
Richard.
very hard for council to be able to do that because you have to honour your own ratepayers. So this is a way of being able to to kind of have those opportunities of partnership that you can't yourself realise, which is quite a good benefit from the CCTO.
Particularly given the resilience of our land, if we're talking about property. Yeah, like, many people have lots in this city.
Do any of the councils around here have CCTOs?
Hbrick does. I mean, look, I came out of Bay of Plenty and we invested everywhere as part of that. Yes, we'd always try and have a preference to do it in our own backyard and back a local horse, but not at the expense of a significantly worse return. You'll take the return and let council do its benefit through the process that it does first. And I think if you did a comparative, if you look at the bigger iwi investment entities, you know, they are quite similar to council investment entities. Yes, they do try and look after their mana whenua, obviously, in terms of what's in their own backyard, but they also recognise the value of earning and investing elsewhere. I mean, Tainui has made exceptional money out of an airport motel at Auckland Airport, and that is not in Tainui's rohi. You know, so they do that, and that is part of their diversification.
Ngāi Tahu would have be examples as well, wouldn't it?
Ngāi Tahu has done the same thing as well. They've
Yeah.
got it, you know, so yes, they will often do a lot of things in their own rohi because it's, again, you get two ticks, you know, but sometimes it is just about the diversification benefit and the transaction's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think our first Achilles heel is we're 105 square kilometres.
Yes.
Try and invest somewhere there and get a good return on investment. There's a whole rest of the country or international that we could get far better return from.
Yep, exactly right. Okay.
So just on that next one, is there another step where we talk about like values around this? So
Yes.
something.
Yeah,
okay.
we'll get into those. Okay. So we'll start with behaviours rather than values, but example, council expects the CCTO to communicate with council on a no surprises basis. The expectation of both entities should be open communications of material issues at both executive and governance levels. Now there's an opening statement. Any comments on that?
I think it's just pretty basic business practice now that you want both ways, no surprises.
Okay, good. And I guess for me, having sat on the other side of the fence, the key comment there is both ways, right? It has to be both ways. And if you look at the failings that have taken place in some parts of the country, and I think Richard alluded to these when he was, voicing his concern around a CCTO, it is that the no surprises is not working both ways. You know, and so therefore it is about the relationship. You got to think of it this way: the relationship between a CCTO and council is solely about trust and confidence, right? So we set some expectations. We trust that you will deliver those. We have confidence that we can go out and execute against that. We don't want you to move the goalposts every 2 minutes, because investing is not, you don't invest now, you don't put a stadium up like this and then decide 2 minutes later that you want to put it 500 metres down the road. You know, you make the decision based off a long-term, and an investment is very much the same as well. Yes, there are some small investments, short-term investments, but the vast majority is about a long-term strategic plan.
Is it normal with a CCTO, I'm just thinking of some of the policies that we have at council, to delineate sort of delegation levels for your CCTO in regards to the type of investment that they are making, whether it be value-based or geographically based or whatever, or is it far looser than that?
Look, CCTOs, in the same way that an executive inside council will have delegations through, depending on the number of people, and we're not looking to have a massive number of people here. Some things, they might bring everything back up to the board for discussion, right? But they will have targets where they want to try and achieve certain forms of delegation, or, and I know even in my scenario, in my previous role, you know, I had I had some quite significant financial delegations where I could trade activity without the board's, approval, because I had the delegation to do it. And that was just because the board had trust and confidence again in the executive that they understood what they were doing, and they had a track record of demonstrating good behaviour. That will come through on the other side of the fence. I guess what we're looking at, and part of the delegations question will come from, because these are council assets. So ultimately, council is going to have to delegate to the board of the CCTO to make the decisions on these. Because again, and we'll talk a little bit about this in terms of relationships soon, but I don't think you want to have a scenario where you've got this investment expertise sitting on the side, but they have to run back to council here for every decision.
Yeah.
on
Sally, are
actual
you
assets.
talking more about whether the CCTO would come back to council if they were going to either acquire or divest an asset
Yeah.
in terms of bringing that back to
Yeah.
the table before they went ahead and made those
Yeah,
decisions?
like what sort of level would it have to be at to kind of trigger that? I guess what I'm thinking about is how do we allow the CCTO to kind of do its job, but provide that level of
Have that reassurance
Yeah,
that you know what's
exactly.
going on and they're not going to be going off on a tangent doing things?
So again, we'll cover that
Oh, sorry.
through here as well.
Yep.
There's two aspects to that, Sally. One is, yes, there is when we bring asset by asset up, we will talk to council about the delegations that we expect to pass across so that the CCTO can do a function. There's another piece that we will discuss, which is the relationship between council and the CCTO, and that's how often do we report back? When do we do it? What is involved in that? So that's the other side of it, which is, making sure that communication exists at different levels as well. And again, communication on these things in terms of the reporting back is actually really, really important, because the trust and confidence of you as councillors in the executive and the director, if I was the executive and Richard was the chair sitting there, having them come and talk to you quarterly and say, this is what we're doing and this is the opportunities we're seeing, and that type of stuff, so that you understand exactly how they are delivering on the mandate you've asked, is the way that you build that trust and confidence, because you see them and you understand exactly what they're trying to do, and they keep that. Yes, there might be some commercial sensitivities they don't bring to an audience, but that's to be expected as well.
But they obviously need the freedom to be able to
Yeah.
operate.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And really it's about setting up for success, isn't it, with good communication tools.
About how many people would we be looking at?
Inside the CCTO,
Yeah.
I would estimate on day one, you'd probably only have two, plus a couple of some independent board members to go with them. And the reason being is that council's operating, because a lot of these things, and I'll use leasehold land as an example. At the moment, what we're looking to get the CCTO to do is we're looking to get them to do the strategic decision-making about what do we do with a certain transaction. If someone comes up and says we want to acquire the interest, is that the right thing to do? Is it not? If someone is unable to pay, could we go and acquire their leasee's interest and do something with the land? Those are strategic kind of decisions. The decision at the next level down of have they paid their annual rental and collection, that stays inside council, because there's no need to move and disrupt the process that actually works okay, that operational level. So you're talking about only that strategic kind of decision-making piece to allow. In some cases, and this is where, as we identified right at the start, Maxine, some of the assets are actually really, really hard to kind of wrench away, because they're so entwined into how council works at both an operational and a strategic level. And so, we're not trying to pick those hard ones first, because
Just two people.
because a lot of it is around investment decision-making, around the execution around land development to make sure you do certain things in a certain way. You don't need a massive number of people.
I think, and just to add to that, what you don't want is to duplicate. So to have, you're still going to have databases and financial systems that are inside the council in managing these assets. So there's no point setting up something that is completely discrete from the way the council functions, and that's just adding cost, you know. So there's probably a little bit of art in this to get that right. Would that be fair?
There is art. There is art in this,
Yeah.
but you know, it's and so again, when we're looking at those assets and we're asking the questions, it's how easy is it to decouple it so that we can actually have. We're not duplicating functions everywhere, because duplicating functions is wasting money. Right? We've got to try and actually make sure that we're only doing the pieces that we need to do. And if there's a function that's working perfectly well, such as collecting the income, the rental in, then we don't need to change that.
Yeah, and I think it's the key part is to be able to get the information around performance of the assets to be able to make strategic decisions. So somehow that bit needs to be driven by the CCTO, doesn't it?
Yep. Okay, so I think we've covered that one well, thank you. Investment mandate. So this is the, obviously there's a relatively simple investment mandate on day one, which is here's a bunch of assets, we already do this. Carry on and try and do it better, please. But actually in time, it will look into some managed funds. It will look at other transactions that may be there. So I guess the questions, you know, what type of investments are permitted? Are there any exclusions, or are there any principles that we wish to apply? What are our expectations around social responsibility?
Nothing illegal.
Nothing illegal, that's a good start.
It's a good start. DK?
Yep,
Yeah, no drugs, no guns.
no drugs, no guns, yep.
There's legal drugs and legal guns.
You don't want to kneecap the organisation.
Front page.
I think the don't
Oh, even
embarrass
the back
council,
page test is all right.
Sorry.
don't embarrass council that you said earlier
Yeah,
comes
okay.
under that.
Good. So, and look, the reason that we've raised this is that you can start, you can do it a number of different ways. You can say, look, here are some principles and some behaviours that we want you to apply. And the front page test is often the best test that sits there. But things do change. So historically, a lot of entities have sat there and said, no armaments. And look, I'm a no armaments type person myself. But if you now look at the scenario where a lot of people are going, yeah, but Ukraine's got to fight for their freedom, and so everyone's going, well, actually armaments. So people's views on things change. Some people go, no fossil fuels. Well, some people go, no mining. But if I didn't mine, then I wouldn't have my phone. So, you know, there's lots of things that we can do, and there's lots of things that we can exclude if we want to go down that. But if you use the example of no fossil fuels, would you be accepting if there was a nice corner site you decided to develop yourself and a service station went on it? Would that be acceptable? If the service station happened to sell lotto tickets, is that acceptable? You know, where do you draw the line on some of these things? What is the responsibility of, And so a lot of it is, do we want to be principles-based or do we want to be exclusions-based?
You know how there are those ethical funds that exist at the moment, you know, with KiwiSaver and stuff like that.
Yep.
Do they provide a bit of a blueprint for what is deemed ethical, or is it just a marketing thing that they make up themselves?
This is a public meeting, isn't it?
Sorry.
Yes, no. Look, there are a number of agencies out there, and there are a number of social responsibility type index providers
Yeah.
that effectively go through, but the degree of where they draw the line on social responsibility changes, right? And so, I mean, even in a New Zealand context, you could sit there and go, okay, we want to try and demonstrate carbon neutrality within our portfolio. So you go, yep, I'm happy to buy Mercury, I'm happy to buy, I'm not happy to buy Genesis because Genesis actually burns imported coal out of Indonesia now, and that comes in through the Port of Tauranga, so that's not good. So you've got all of these things about where do you start and stop. So yes, there are social funds, and those social funds do have degrees of exclusions in terms of what they cut out. Some of the most common ones just cut out things like tobacco and gambling and a couple of other things, and they're relatively simple. But you can go all the way down to I don't want any mining and I don't want any fossil fuels and I only want vegetarian and only, you can go as far as you like, and there are different indexes for everything. And they're all fine.
Let's make money.
Yeah, I reckon we don't want to be seen to be unethical,
Yep.
or blatantly unethical. So if it is tobacco, gambling or fossil fuels, people are going to say, hey, that's unethical, and that will be front page. So
Yes.
I think we can definitely draw a line at those big ones.
Yep.
It's an opinion, though.
That's an opinion, but I think it is a front page thing.
What about that service station example, though?
I don't like that idea of a service
don't- you
station.
don't
Not
think
at
we should?
all, not at all.
Well, that's a fair call, but has this council got a plan to replace its generators that it just bought that run on petrol? Or are you not going to run them if there's a disaster? Where do ethics start?
Yeah, but a service station's on a different level.
Well, we've got to get the petrol from somewhere.
I like the principles-based
Yep.
discussion rather than the exclusions-based one, just because I think there will be so many different scenarios, and some of it you can go right down to a granular level, right? You can talk about one part of it that might be petrochemical based or something like that, but it's this tiny little part. Do you write the whole thing off? And you've
Yep.
got to put that lens over the top of, is it front page news? Is it embarrassing to council? Is it meeting all these other outcomes, and allow you to have like a case by case inquiry into each opportunity? Because if we just say, no, anything, under this heading or that heading or that heading, actually, if you dig down into lots of investment decisions, you'll be able to find something probably under those headings buried somewhere in it, and it's a 0.003% of it,
Yeah.
but it's in there. So at what level do you exclude? It just gets too complicated, is my view.
Yes.
I agree.
Can one of our principles be that it's ethical? I mean, that's a principle that we want to be ethical, we're aiming to be ethical. We don't want to be unethical.
Subjective. What's
Well,
ethical to one person may not be ethical to another.
Tobacco, is that ethical?
So, look, yes, you can go there. You can cover that through a number of different ways as well. I guess your ethical is, I think what you're trying to do is avoid the really subjective pieces is the best way to look at it. So some examples, sorry Hayley, I'll come back to you in a second. Some examples, like the New Zealand Super Fund, for example, has some specific exclusions, right? So they do exclude tobacco, they do exclude gambling, they do exclude, certain types of armaments, cluster munition makers and semi-automatic rifle makers and a few other bits and pieces. Then they've got a couple of other interesting exclusions which are good. They exclude anybody who is contrary to the objectives of New Zealand. So in other words, so Russia is out at the moment, right?
Oh, well, I'm not allowed in Russia, so yeah.
So there we go. Well, we better not put any money in there.
Black and white then, huh?
So, so that's an example. In my Quayside context, I excluded anything that was contrary to the objectives of my council, right? So if I wouldn't invest into a company who was actively opposed to my council in terms of trying to do something within my own backyard. And that was just because it starts to demonstrate a conflict of interest, right? But actually, that statement doesn't necessarily preclude an awful lot. Probably if you're getting down to investing into individual companies, maybe it does. But at a New Zealand stock market type or a global stock market level, no, it doesn't. But, you start to, if you look at, I think, some examples, and maybe as a recommendation, we look at someone like the Super Fund, as being Big Brother, saying, hey, look, you guys have got some principles that are there. These are the things that you look for. We think that is an acceptable standard for ourselves as a starting point.
I think one of the things we have to be quite careful about here is that each of these decisions, we have to go back to our objectives.
Yep.
We have to say, if we make this decision under the investment mandate, are we kneecapping the opportunity in one of the objectives? No, I think we have to take a really balanced approach to that.
Yep.
Because otherwise what we're doing is, A, we'll limit the calibre of the people that want to be our directors because they'll say it's going to be too hard.
Yes.
And then we'll also potentially have the offset of community backlash if we're not being prudent in
Yep.
some of the decision-making.
And I think to pick up on Richard's point earlier, you know, we also need to make sure that the pot's not calling the kettle black on some of these things and going, well, you know, we shouldn't be investing in those, but actually as a council, we still do that ourselves. So I know previously, you know, there was a call for local government to request that banks ban lending to mining. It's like, well, hang on, guys, but we own a port and we run diesel buses and we do this and we've, you know, we need generators that run on fossil fuel, et cetera, actually, we've got to sort our own selves out before we start pointing the finger at everybody else. I think you want to at least have the same standards that you have within council, within your CCTO, in terms of where you go and how you do it, because you don't want your CCTO to be dragging the chain and embarrassing you, because we've got this set of standards and they're down here. But I think it's also risky if you sit there and say, this is our set of standards and we want you guys to be way up here.
I think the trick is, if there's, I don't know, we'll talk petrol for an example. If there's one doing it well and one who's exploiting the world or leaking stuff everywhere, then you choose the one who's doing it well, not investing in the bad one, for a better term.
Yep. So where I think that sits is that if you look at things like the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, which is basically doesn't exclude an awful lot of stuff, but what they are looking at is things like ESG principles, you know, and a lot of things like mining, they actually sit there and they don't say they're bad, because you get things like a Fortescue or something like that, where they're actually putting a lot of money into green energy, because they sit there and go, well, this is actually, we recognise that we need to do something and we're doing this. And you go, well, that's good governance and good social practice. Whereas others that just, you know, burn forest down are not necessarily the type that you want. And so there are ESG standards that do sit out there. Again, thinking about where we are and the nature of the assets that we have today, we have $0 in managed funds today. You know, so we don't want to make this thing so complicated that, but let's start with some principles and some objectives and some absolute no-nos, you know, but maybe the super fund as an example could be. And we can bring that back in terms of what that looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, Hayley. Sorry.
Yeah, I've been trying to find it and I can't, but I've seen a presentation on responsible and ethical investing, and there was a scale that had, I think it was like 5 different areas, and one was that you exclude tobacco and guns or whatever, and then right at the other end was investments which were solely done for social investment things.
Purpose.
I was just wondering whether we could maybe have something like that, like a framework that's already developed, that we could then see where we sit on that, rather than us trying to go, we're fine with guns, but we're not keen on fuel. And there was like 4 or 5 different examples, so, yeah.
That's totally what I was, I want to know what already exists that we can use as a gauge.
Yep.
Yeah, and so the super fund, I think deals with what Annie was saying, and a framework like that would be great.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there is that. I will use an example in terms of that, because you're right, there are different levels of investments. Some of the ones which are very purpose-driven do struggle on the commercial objectives in some cases.
I'm not expecting that we'll be at that end,
No,
but
no,
it's a framework
you're
that we
right,
can use.
It is a framework. It is a framework, and I know that in my previous role, you know, we looked at some of those, but actually we didn't invest because they wouldn't have helped us to achieve our commercial investment. You know, they were almost asking me to do the community role, which I wasn't actually set to do. I was set to create a return for the council.
I think it's just helpful for us to see it together. So, you know, like
Yep.
at the top of the pyramid, we have that commerciality, like that is
Yes.
the top thing, right?
Yep.
But we do need to overlay these other things with it, or consider them against that objective, so that we can feel comfortable about what we're putting for the new organisation.
It's also worth noting, I think, that you do have another bite at the cherry every year.
Yeah.
And we are starting off with, you kind of know pretty much that what's on the table in terms of what the assets are likely to be in terms of the CCO, and that there's no cash really for that much reinvestment. So I'm not sure in the first year you'd be expecting a lot of kind of investment. Would that be fair in terms of?
It'll be a drip feed over time.
That's right. So
And which is why, even though we get the bite at the cherry every year,
yeah.
it feels like what we do the first time round actually needs to stand for a while in order to
Yeah.
give it the opportunity to start,
Yeah.
returning.
And that's exactly why this meeting, I think, is
Yeah.
really, really important, because actually what you're doing is you're setting the framework
Yeah.
for how this thing works, and we don't want to move the goalposts, as we can see outside, all the time, because actually they've got to then set their target and set their path and going. This question at the bottom, I guess, grow resilience, profit retention and distribution. If you think of the assets that you have today and you think of the behaviour that council has today, and I'll use leasehold property, we collect a rental in, we have a cost to achieve that ultimately, and the net benefit is then applied into council to reduce rates and do other services. So that's an example, but actually it doesn't leave anything behind, except for the fact that the asset slowly grows over time in terms of its value as inflation kind of increases the land value that sits there. If you think of, if you were the other way round and you had $150 million of managed funds, and let's say that they, so this is a bit of a nirvana question because we're not there today, but if you had that and that was producing, and I'll use the Auckland Future Fund, 7.5% return or thereabouts is their target, and you said inflation is going to be 2 to 2.5% a year, do you take 5%? Do you take 3%? Do you take, so that's really the question, and that comes back to, I think, that piece that Annette, and I'll come to you in a second, Annette, that you were asking right at the start, which is, okay, once we start to grow and diversify, are we expecting to take everything off the table? Or are we, at the moment, that's what you do, and we have to carry that on because we've got a long-term plan that assumes that we're going to keep earning something. But as we start, and this might be 5 or 10 years down the track, as you start to get a little bit more diversified, the opportunity to grow and consider resilience and other things actually changes. Sorry, Annette?
No, just some discussion in this space. And I'll start that with a question. Have we quantified what the return to rates is currently from these assets in the first pick? And the reason I ask that is is it palatable, possible, financially sustainable for us to say to the CCTO, 10 years, 10-year block, here's your set of first pick investments, 10% per annum average return over your 10 years, double it, could build a investment portfolio that's worth taking a return off rather than the stripping it as it goes kind of situation. So I'm just thinking about what I would do, because you want to get that compounding benefit, and your best time to do that is probably at the beginning rather than this sort of slowly approach. Is it financially possible for us to do something like that, or is the impact too high? Have we quantified that?
So I think there are a couple of challenges, and we know that our income from parklands effectively only extends for another 3 or 4 years, and after that point it effectively drops off, and that will impact a requirement for an increase in rates to replace that income, so that's a particular issue. So I think there are a couple of complexities around how we look at what income we take out of the portfolio over time, but I agree with what you're saying. I think we need to be a bit measured around return expectations in terms of offsetting rates probably in that first 10-year period aren't going to be significant because we do need to inflation-proof the portfolio fund, and we need to probably try and build some resilience in terms of a reserve fund for years that potentially the portfolio can't return a dividend through to council, because you don't want to be in a position where for some particular year, for some reason, the CCTO can't pass through a dividend, and then we've got a complete shortfall in revenue that particular year, and we either have to borrow to replace the income expectation or we have to rely on rates. So we wouldn't want to be going out and putting up rates because we haven't had a return from the investment portfolio. So it's a bit of a balancing act, I think.
But doesn't that come back down to our principles and our objectives? In other words, should we simply be seeing as a cash cow we're milking to offset rates, or should we be seeing the return from the investment company as being an opportunity to commit to a particular outcome or a particular project
I think
objective,
that's right. What I'm saying is the challenge we do have is around our parklands income. Yeah. And we have been using that as a cash cow, so.
But that's what I'm saying, change the focus.
Yeah.
In other words, instead of just seeing it as regular income, because if we project-based it or whatever it may be, if the incomes don't occur, we can always push out a project or an activity but still achieve an outcome over time rather than just paying off cash.
Yeah. But I think it's, we're setting expectations that it's a long-term focus here. So we're setting an expectation that we want the fund to grow over time. And I think it's setting those sort of intermediate long-term objectives is useful.
So if I can just draw our attention back to this earlier slide, there is an assumption that we are earning some money out of parklands every year. There is an assumption that we're earning some money out of our annuities that we have at the moment, and council is taking pretty much 100% of that as it comes out in this current state. What we have tried to do through the investment returns here is try to smooth this as much as possible. So there is a little bit of provision for ups and downs. Would have been nice if we were in and up here as opposed to potentially a down year on day one, but that objective sits there, and that is about making sure that we stop the behaviour that was historically had, which is in a great year, it's like drinking from a fire hydrant in terms of how much we actually get in. And in a bad year, it's you turn the tap on and it just drips out, So we're trying to at least get it so that it's consistent. And maybe one of the principles that we're talking about here is actually, look, we do want the CCTO to try and deliver a consistent growing return to council. We acknowledge there's not a lot of resilience there on day one, but we want you to grow that resilience, and council's expectation is that when we have good years, that you hold that back and reinvest it so that we can then cover those lesser years as they come through. The challenge you have right now is that your long-term plan and the way that you've behaved in the past has always been that everything you get, you consume, right? And so we kind of had to build it to a degree based on some of those things going forward, but there is a little bit of diversification. There'll be a little bit of value that gets created over time. But you might want to think about putting some objectives in there, and then you've got to support these objectives in terms of how you work with the CCTO in the future. But I worked with my council to make sure that I had, on day one, 100% of my port dividend as a reserve. Now, you don't have a port dividend, but it might be 100% of Parklands income that's due for next year. You've actually got that sitting up your sleeve so that if next year it's 2024 and you're not selling as many sections, you've actually got the cash in the pocket so the council doesn't have no ability to feed its family and to do its work. And you might sit there and say, look, we want you to try and generate that as a minimum thing, and we want you to try and achieve that within the first 5 years. And we will stick with and that might put some discipline back onto council as well, which sits there and says, look, our long-term plan says we're going to earn this much this year, this much next year, this much the year after. Probably means we're going to struggle to go back out and say, hey, can you ramp that up from 5 to 7? Yeah. Because then you strip your own resilience away. But is that resilience an objective that you want to try and build in? The second question would be how, but
When you go to an investment advisor, they ask you, do you want, high risk, low risk, where are you, basically? And I wondered if those might be something that we could build in, how much of it we want sort of, return high risk, and how much is sort of steady as you go, and how much is like money in the bank, that kind of proportion.
Yes, there's a little bit of that, and we do build that in. Yeah, but if you think about the assets that you're actually putting into the CCTO, you are actually high risk now, right? They're all land-based assets. They're not cash. They're not easy to turn into cash. You're actually, but that's okay, because as we've discussed earlier, you're an intergenerational fund. You're an intergenerational investor. You hold things for a long time, and so it's okay if you are investing into those things. You need to make sure that those assets are able to return a little bit of cash each time so that you're able to keep feeding council. But you will, again, within a portfolio, it's probably the question more is, does the portfolio allow us to get the cash out that we need to support council? And if you're in a resilience type environment, where maybe I've got $3 or $4 or $5 million sitting up there as a resilience buffer, is that held in such a way that I could liquidate it if I had to for next year?
I'm used to building the resilience part, just throwing it out there. Feel like we didn't.
Sorry, what did you say?
I'm a yes to building that resilience in the fund, just to provide some clarity to you guys and some guidance. Yeah. Well, it makes sense. I mean, that's kind of the growth portion of it, and setting. I'm not sure what the level would look like. I mean, I'd expect that you guys know more about that than
we'll come back with some recommendations on that.
Yeah.
It's worth thinking about too that, with the Parklands asset, a finite kind of resource, and one that we haven't kind of used to reinvest anywhere. The other side of the coin is looking for stage 5 of Parklands that is available. And there are some opportunities there, but that requires a willingness, I think, in terms of the council's discussion to go to those places as well, because often they have even slightly competing uses. And the other thing I wanted to mention was at the moment, while the sales aren't so good with Parklands, it is actually it's becoming a better time to actually get things ready for sale, which you don't want to wait until the market comes right. Now that, of course, means that your expenditure is high and your income is low. So at the front end, that's in terms of the land one. If you don't, and our issue is that we're heavily invested in land.
And so, in a statement of expectations, would we say something around our expectation of a percentage of return back to us in years 1 to whatever, or is that, so it's prescriptive?
So yes, you will put some return expectations in there, and the nice thing is you've just gone through a long-term plan, so you know roughly what you're expecting, but you would also sit there and say that, where the CCTO earns more than that, we would like you to retain that to build resilience and invest into new opportunities, or something similar, so that you start to set the expectation of what you want it to achieve over time. And it's not just if you make more money, we want that too.
Cool.
So, this is why, again, this is, you put these expectations out there. And again, if we come back to the presentation that we're going to have in a couple of weeks' time, where we start to think about how do we find the right people, they want to know, okay, if we actually do something well, do we just give it all away, or do we give it all to council? So giving it away probably sounds bad. Do we give it all to council, or actually are we there to reinvest? And what are you asking me to do? Okay, good conversation. Thank you.
Just wondering, in terms of principles, when we talk about things like As an example of a principle that you'd like to hear, something like, if you have the option to support local, that we would like you to take that. Is that the sort of thing, or how would those sorts of things come forward?
You can talk about,
I'm thinking like if they had to hire a contractor, so
Yep.
supporting local businesses rather than investing in local.
yep, look, we can put something in there in terms of those.
I think, again, you've still got to look at everything, ultimately with that lens of the primary objective being commercial return.
Yeah.
So I
Totally.
think you could include it, but it would need to be on a weightings type basis.
Yeah, where,
Yeah, and I don't think you'd expect them to kind of perform outside of council's own procurement policy. So we obviously have some principles or objectives around local purchasing and supporting local through our procurement policy, but we wouldn't expect the CCTO to go any further beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably the better question. How does the CCTO and the procurement policy interlink? Yeah, are the values, do they cross over?
In fact, council policies in general.
Yeah, so you're sort of saying that you want the CCTO to adopt some of the same principles as council from that perspective.
so again, these are, I'll say these are some of the fishhooks in the sense that, or some of the policies that we referred to right back at the start. So, when we're looking at each individual asset, we want to look at the council policies and goes, well, what does that actually mean for us in terms of the way that we behave? Like shares in the airport is nice and easy. It's a strategic asset. You can't sell it without the approval of consultation with the ratepayer. So that's an understood process. You've got a policy at the moment around investment property. And so therefore, that has to get picked up on day one. Is that policy right? Well, those are some of the things we'll need to consider. We'll need to look at the process around procurement policies and other bits and pieces just to make sure they actually work for the environment that's there. Because again, you don't have a massive team sitting on the other side of the fence. But, there are some things that we need to make sure that we do. And council might sit there and go, yep, we're happy that you do this, but we want you must do this. You don't have to do that. These are, so again, we'll look at some of those pieces and bring them back on an asset-by-asset basis as well. But again, this is about how do we create that draft for you to go back and consider. And
Because one of the things with procurement, for example, is you still have to have agility, and sometimes those are not, they're mutually exclusive kind of thing. And give examples that you may want to, use a particular alliance or something like that for a product. We go there, but that is not the nimble local operator that you might want to use for a land development thing or whatever. You don't want a big company necessarily. So we need to have some flexibility, I think, in operation to be able to keep on, as Mia's saying, keep focused on that commercial objective as your primary thing, and it's got to work and it's got to line up with that. Yeah.
I was more thinking probably in a situation where all things being equal and you've got an out of town and a local supplier.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's where our value
Preference be
would,
given.
the principles around it. So just, how that works.
Yep, and again, we can articulate that, the objective is commercial. However, where you can add other benefit, including buying local, without compromising that objective, then we'd expect you to be able to do that. That's those ands type pieces.
Yeah. And I suppose it feels a bit clunky if we're to go including buying and doing all of those, so maybe referencing something like I don't know, you guys will work it out, but how we do that in a cohesive, agile manner. Yeah.
We can talk a little bit about, do you talk about regional benefit or territorial benefit in terms of the term? In terms of what, benefit to the city? Is it benefit to the city or benefit to the region that you're trying to achieve?
I think in the first instance to the city.
To the city, so.
Broader benefits to the region. I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
So, when we talk about benefit to the city, we can look at, the objective first and foremost is right back at that first piece is to generate a commercial return, but we're always looking for ways that we can add to the other well-beings, including procurement,
Yeah.
as part of that, and we should be recognising those opportunities. So we can bring it into that as a broad kind of expectation.
Opportunities is good.
Okay, a couple more to go. So this one here, relationship and reporting to council. So this is a little bit around, what are your expectations in terms of how does the CCTO feed back in and out to you? So examples might be quarterly presentations to council, they might be quarterly reports, they might be actual presentations where someone comes and sits here like this and says, this is what we're doing, this is how we've gone. You've got the statement of expectations and you'll have the statement of intent. That's mandated anyway. You don't have to do a statement of expectations, but recommendation that you do. Do you want, and it depends on the individuals you get on, do you want them to come and support council on some other things? Do you want them to look at some of the other council assets and go, oh, that might be interesting. Could we do something with this? So again, it's just when we talk about, and again, think of it through the position description, because it's almost, your expectations going out there and saying, this is what we want you to do. If you're an independent director going into these roles, what are you expecting me to do? So is there any views in terms of that, Chad?
Would it be a good idea if we appointed an elected member to the CCTO, or what would the pros and cons be with that pathway?
Yep.
A little bit concerned about the powers we'll be delegating them, and while we can set the overall goals, the opportunities to have input into the pathways they take to reach those goals.
Yep. So yes, answer that in two parts. So I guess in the next meeting, we will talk about, I guess, the makeup of that board. And that will include the level of elected representation and the level of independent representation and the skill sets that we want to try and see around that table, and how do we get the right people in the right places. So if we can pick that one up next time, that would be cool. In terms of the level of delegation that is expected from council, again, I think this has to be on an asset-by-asset basis as well. So you're looking at, for these assets, we expect that you can go out and do X, Y, and Z. For those ones that you can't, so for the airport, if it's airport shares, you don't have authority to go and sell them.
No.
Because that is restricted under the Strategic Assets in the Local Government Act anyway. But you may bring recommendations up to council on certain things, absolutely. So, we will look at the delegations on each of those asset-by-asset basis. And it might be even within certain assets that you have, certain levels of cap or something like that, so that if something wholesale is taking place that actually you end up knowing, but if it's just little things around the edges, then that happens as a standard delegation to the CCTO. But we can talk a little bit about that at an asset level.
So what's best practice? Is it to go asset by asset, or is it to develop asset classes, and then as we divest assets into the investment company, we say that it fits into this class, and then rather than, otherwise we're being very prescriptive?
You'd need the diversification of your assets, right? You'd need to have more to create the classes.
Yes.
So that would be in the long run type of thing?
Yeah, but we do need to, look, in the case of a quayside, 95% of the assets that it managed were actually Quayside's assets. So, and 5% were council's assets.
Yeah, gotcha.
In the case of HBRIC, where it is now, the port is an HBRIC asset and some shares, but actually probably 50 to 60%, and probably most of the stuff you'd be active around is actually council.
Yeah.
And so therefore there's a delegation that goes with that. So, but these are still council assets. And so ultimately they need a delegation. If they were the asset of the CCTO, then actually it's not, it's already delegated to them anyway, because ultimately it's their responsibility as a company to look after their own assets as a board member. But on day one, the CCTO is effectively a management company that's there to do a service for you guys as an investment manager. And they are acting on assets of council under delegation in the same way that you would delegate to Louise, and Louise would suggest, etc., today.
So what about liability? Where does that sit? Would that be on a case-by-case?
In terms of raising debt and other things, you mean? Yeah, look, these are, on day one, these are council assets with council liabilities that do sit on them. Where, and this might be in the future, if it identified a new land block that was outside or wanted to do a significant development outside, I might do that in the name of the CCTO rather than in the name of council, because council then doesn't take the liability on in that relation. But if you think of everything you're doing now, you've actually got the liability for the transactions today. You are the land developer at Parklands. That is, so we're not looking to change any of those things on day one. But for new opportunities, yes, they'll go through on a case-by-case basis to sit there and determine who should be ultimately looking after it.
The delegation that is given to the CCTO by asset, by council,
Yes.
where is that contained? And does it then inform like an operational policy within the CCTO? Like where does it sit? Where is it recorded? Is it? Yeah.
You have a delegated authorities policy at the moment that sits there.
Yeah.
And I guess part of that would note that the delegation goes to the CCTO for certain assets.
So that's where it would sit in our delegation
Yes.
policy. Okay. Yeah.
I'm keen to tease out this example you've provided around advice into council on other matters and how that would work in a practical sense.
Yep. So I guess think about it in terms of the expertise that you're going to have sitting on the other side of the fence, which is a little bit into kind of the next time discussion. But if you've got investment expertise, you've maybe got property development expertise, you've got some broader investment decision-making expertise, you may have, well, I'll use Awatoto again. You might have a land block down there where you're sitting there going, what do we do with this? And they might sit there and go, well, actually, commercially, there's an opportunity where we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do this. But you'd have to split that part from that part to allow that to take place. I guess a little bit the same as you have at the top of Hospital Hill, where you've split off the water and you've got the residual land, right? So those types of things are examples where they maybe aren't the day one asset that you're putting across, but you would hope that your CCTO could give you support. Or it might be on some of the assets that stay in.
Community housing, the sites that
Yep.
council's looking to potentially divest, then that would be a good one to get
Yep.
a commercial framework over the top of.
Yeah. So I think there's lots of things where you've got, you possibly don't look at the commercial opportunities fully today, because you look at through the full wellbeings kind of eye set, which is why you're here.
Yeah, might be something like the reimagining project at the aquarium, where we might ask them to look at it, perform some due diligence on a business case or a preferred option or something like that, where we could ask for some advice or some strategic direction.
Yep.
Skills that you get. So look, I think, again, it can just be as simple as a line or two that sits inside a statement of expectation. Council may look to seek advice
Yeah.
on commercial transactions, of its own matters in addition, or something similar. Just the standard one at the bottom that says in any other role that the chief executive might decide. It's that type of.
Ask them to wear different hats.
You could also, potentially look at asking the CCTO to be proactively trying to point out opportunities for further, like land commercial investments inside of Napier, for example. So if you are thinking about that area 5 of Parklands, like for them to exercise their mind as to where that might be and come back, for example.
Yep. Okay.
So I'm just looking at some of those other kind of questions there as well. What's commonplace for CCTOs is obviously they come and they'll talk to council. You know, for council is that presentation that you want to receive back at a public forum level, you know, or is it a PE? It might have some parts that are public excluded because of the commercial sensitivity, but actually, you know, how do you get community confidence into what the CCTO is doing? Because when they have a board meeting, for example, you generally won't have members of the public sitting in those because they are all about commercial matters. But, you know, how do we engender community confidence in terms of what's happening? And it may be that, look, you know, it is, yes, we have 4 meetings a year. We want those meetings to be public meetings where the public can understand and hear the presentation from and then there might be some public excluded components of it if there are certain transactions where you need council's approval for X, Y, or Z. But look, those are just some of the things that you want to try and think about because, again, if we come back to the consultation process and you come back to some of the concerns that were raised through the consultation process, you know, a lot of that is how does council make sure that this thing here is doing what it should be doing? And how do we make sure that council's making sure that it's doing what it should be doing? You know, so it's just thinking through that, you know, our expectation is that you will present 4 times a year to council.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the committee structure anyway set up, so it would just make sense for it to come to committee. We're a whole anyway of council, so in quarterly, I think it would allow the community to get used to it as well with that sort of frequency.
Yep.
I wouldn't want it to be 6 monthly, I don't think. I think we need to, you know, quarterly strikes the right balance. And I'm really interested in what that reporting would look like. I'm making a little bit of a list of things that would be helpful for me. And one of them would be the reporting and how we would standardise that. So, you know, considering the Irish flag before.
Yes.
Just even if that is included in the reporting against those things. So obviously the commercial thing is first and foremost, but if every single time there is some acknowledgement of those other things, those other well-beings and stuff, like just getting it so that it looks the same each time. We know what we're going to expect, that the public can see it all the time and it's the same thing and easily understood. I think that would be useful.
Yes.
The question, do you think there'll be significant change in quarters?
No, look, often a lot of these things are slow burns.
Yeah.
And so, but, you know, if you think of it on an annual basis, and so if I go back to my previous role, I used to do, an annual financial in terms of how have we gone on an annual basis. You've got a statement of expectations and a statement of intent response, so there's a kind of theme that goes into another one. You'd expect the board to sit there and kind of do a strategic framework kind of objective once a year as well, so there's another presentation that kind of goes in. So some of the operating fundamentals that sit underneath, I don't expect they're going to go up and down like this, right? But there are topics that maybe you can introduce, you know, the annual financial return, the response to the statement of expectations, the strategy that you're working towards, maybe an asset review or a discussion around a certain asset class and what you're doing might come in, you know, so the different, we'll call them the strategic kind of pieces that sit across the top, which are of interest to council as well, because that's the piece that you don't have today in terms of the management of those assets, and that's where you're going to start to get some of your value. But, you know,
The
return on investment
result
is not going to necessarily change significantly in a quarter.
it won't change overnight, no.
Yeah, no, I understand.
But it will happen, as the assets.
So just out of curiosity, how frequently
Yes.
the board be meeting?
And again, that's probably something that we'll work out in the next,
Yeah, so
in the
how-
next
what's
one.
the string? Yeah.
But I would expect Well, we'll talk about that next time, actually.
Yeah, no, but what I mean is, if we're talking about expectations of reporting back to council,
Yep.
and the board's only meeting 3 times once a month,
Yeah.
then we're saying every third time they meet, they're reporting back to council. Is that actually a good investment of time?
Yeah, it's,
I think though, in the longer term, I can that rationale should kick in, but because this is brand new for everyone, I see value, especially for the community, considering some of the feedback that we got. Like, our understanding of it, we've had so many workshops, etc. But for them, they haven't. Trust and confidence is low anyway. So we're trying to build that for our community as well, and to give them that level of understanding. So in my mind, actually, the more they see it, and the more opportunity that they have to hear us question or to receive information, I think that that's actually really valuable.
There might also be, currently, if the assets stay on the council's balance sheets, you're going to have to quarterly report anyway. So it might not be necessarily an elaborate report every time, but a check-in kind of style with a standard framework, and then once a year you do something more substantial or something like that.
The thing that stands out in my mind that was questioned, seemed like the most, was how does council kind of maintain control over those things? It was the separation was actually the thing that caused the most anxiety. So, having them come and present quarterly actually should help quell some of that and demonstrate how we do that.
yes.
Agreeing with Councillor Crown. Sorry, you go.
No, Annette's been trying to go for quite some time now.
It's all right. I'm at the back of the room. I think my question probably comes in nicely after that discussion anyway, and doesn't fit nicely into any of the questions on the board, but how do we protect the CCO or TO from council is my question.
Yep.
And the reason I ask that is the only example of really front page hitting, long lasting decisions of a CCTO that spring to my mind. It was where they received so much pressure from council to return an income that they made a poor short-term decision around their investments. And so, in my view, or what turned out in time to be a poor decision, I think. So how do we actually protect the kind of kaupapa of the CCTO from successive council short-term pressure?
So there are a number of ways that it can be done. I think, look, your statement of expectations and setting that in play is critical, because ultimately then you've sat there and said, look, this is what previous councils have agreed and this is what you're doing. You may elect to protect the value of the asset that sits under the CCTO, through making it a strategic asset of some type in terms of as a collective pool. That means that you can't go and rate it, but that's slightly different. Look, a lot of what I've found with my experience is that once the trust and confidence is built up, then, and if you have a change of council or you have all of those other things that come through, the returning members take the new members under their arm and go, look, this is what this thing here does. This is how it's delivered for us. This is what it's there to achieve. And our focus is here, and it does its piece, and it feeds us a certain amount each year. And that tends to become a little bit of a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy and process.
Yeah, I think that works well 99% of the time. It's the 1% that you just want to, you can't rely on that. And we do see that you can get councils that have significant turnover and priorities change pretty quickly and that sort of stuff. And this is meant to be long intergenerational things.
I think by having a majority of independent board members is also helpful in that respect, because otherwise you potentially do, if you have quite a significant turnover of elected members from one term to the next, and then you have if you had a majority of elected members as your board members, and then you have a significant turnover and they have a different view or vision of what the CCTO should be doing, that can change direction quite quickly.
Can council say to the CCTO, we need a 30% return this year, and their only way to do that, or we needed this dollar amount this year?
They can request a special dividend.
But they're not required to fulfill it?
that's the relationship between the CCTO.
Yeah.
The CCTO could turn around and say, we actually can't do that without borrowing
Or selling.
or divesting assets, yeah.
And then council goes, that's fine, sell or divest. And that's what I want to protect about. And I think it does sit under this relationship.
Yeah, so look, again, we can talk a little bit around, like, we're talking about creating a portfolio of assets here. And for me, what's not actually most critical is the assets themselves. It's the value of the assets, because it's the value of the assets that you want to inflate. And actually, it doesn't matter whether it's a building A or building B. It's just a portfolio of assets that we want to look after for future generations. Now, we haven't really discussed whether that as a portfolio becomes a strategic asset or not, which puts a level of protection across the top of it. Your other aspects of protection, again, are the things that we'll discuss next time, which is how do you put the right people around the table. And we've discussed a little bit today the concept of no surprises. And yes, council does have the right to sit there and go at the next one, oh, well, actually, we said no surprises, but guess what? We're going to give you a surprise. But again, council would normally pull itself up on some of those things and say, well, hang on, we've got no surprises both ways. We don't expect, you've been aiming for this, you've been aiming for this, you've been aiming for this, you're geared for that. We now want you over here.
That was a good point in terms of recognising the value of the portfolio as a strategic asset. So that is one way to protect the value of the portfolio from some of those requests from council. Yeah.
And again, you might sit there and say that, look, it's the inflation-proof value of the portfolio as opposed to just the value today, because that way you've at least having to leave behind the growth factor that relates to inflation. And yes, it constrains council to a degree, but it constrains it for its own benefit. So there's a...
I would be quite keen for us to explore that and maybe if there's any other mechanisms to think of in the meantime. Because, we need to protect ourselves against decisions of the CCTO and lots of conversations about that, but it does go the other way as well.
Cool.
Would that protection then be developed as part of one of our principles, that we wouldn't seek sudden changes in direction, or is there a way we can word a principle that gives us, as we make decisions, we go back to the principles and say, well, can we reasonably ask these things?
Yep.
Shouldn't that be in our principles?
Well, again, I think, yes, council should, if you go right back to those things that were brought forward from previous meetings, that we want to try and create an intergenerational benefit. We want to get a return each year for ourselves, but we want to preserve a return for the future. And again, if council's happy to sit there and state that, look, that is the purpose that we're trying to achieve, yes, they consider in the letter of expectations at the top, and consider at the CCTO's website, as these are our purposes as well, and they become well understood by multiple parties. Everything can get changed, but you make it harder.
Could there even be some wording around the request for special dividends? So we're putting a principle in place that it's not going to be our standard practice, or it's only as a result of, extenuating
Some criteria.
around that. So it's not something that we have future CFOs sitting in front of us going, oh yeah, well, you could just ask for a special dividend of CCTO, if you know what I mean. You want to give it an elevated step. It's not part of our normal operating practice.
Yep. Yes, you can do that, and you can even, I'm trying to think how you do it, but you might even sit there and say, look, your objective, and we've talked about resilience and growing resilience, and that might be over and above what's the strategic component of it if we use strategic assets as a concept. And then you're almost, any special dividend can only be the resilience component anyway. It can't be the corpus of the asset. So we'll look at some of those things and bring them back. Okay, is there any other comments on this relationship piece in terms of the relationship with council?
Something I've been asked is how much are they going to cost?
Which the
CCTO, and
Yep.
Where does the money come from? Hopefully they'll be paying for themselves after it.
Yeah, exactly. And look, they will be paying for themselves as the principle that you've got there. So I think, I can't remember exactly what the number was off the top of my head, Maxine, but it's probably about 750K or thereabouts for the establishment. That includes paying of your board and a couple of executive members. I can bring those numbers to the next update.
And that just comes from the rates, does it?
Look, ultimately, you should be able to grow some of the investment returns out of some of these things. The first thing they've got to do is pay for themselves. And then the second thing they do is start to increase the return to the council. So, the objective is that, no, you don't need to fund too much out of and if this thing doesn't pay for itself, then you shouldn't be doing it, But I think we've already seen through some of the work that Richard started, even at looking at, our development opportunities, that there is opportunity to improve the return that council's getting out of its existing assets, and that's why we're doing this.
There might be a bit of a time lag until that's all.
Okay, community and partnerships. So this one here, I've actually just snipped it straight out of HBRIC's statement of expectations. The primary objective of HBRIC as a CCTO is to make commercial returns for council, demonstrated first and foremost through a distribution to council, and secondly through growing resilience of the asset base. Council wishes to see HBRIC become a respected partner of the investment community. So this is really the piece is look, is this an expectation that you have of your CCTO? And council supports it as a direct investor into the region. So look, the reason I'm asking this is, what is your expectation of this entity? Is it to sit there and just look purely inwards at council? How do you want it to try and achieve things? Because one of the things that a CCTO gives you is the ability to do partnerships that council can't do. But where is, how broad do you want your CCTO to look? How close to the community in terms of some of these partnerships and opportunities do you want it to participate?
I think it's a key part of a role of CCTO to actually be an attractive proposition for other parts of the investment community to approach and engage and work together.
Yep. Okay.
I quite like what they've got there, except for the last sentence, a direct investor into the region. I would perhaps take that out, but maybe put something about a respected, I'm just thinking about partnerships with
Yep.
a respected partner in the investment community probably covers that.
Okay.
Did you say you didn't like the direct investor into the region part?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we should be ring-fenced around. That, to me, indicates that we're going to invest within our region.
Yes.
I think we can look to invest outside our region if the partnerships are there, If we are regarded as a respected partner and investor, then we're looking to maximise our return.
Yes.
And that may be with a partner that's outside of Hawke's Bay.
Okay.
Does that statement exclude that, though?
No, not necessarily.
No, that statement, does it exclude going regionally, or does it?
No, it doesn't. It's just, it just notes that, I guess in this case, it notes that they have some local regional investments anyway.
Because it's regional council.
Well, it's a regional council.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compared to nature.
Yeah. Whether it's.
I guess we're just testing whether or not you want to give priority to investing in Napier specifically, and then the region more broadly after that, and then more wider, after that, or whether you don't want to give any preference to Napier, then the region more broadly. It's just kind of a...
Feels like everyone's just open.
Yeah, sounds like it, yeah.
And the Food East is actually quite an interesting example, given that I think.
Maybe
and
It's not particularly commercial.
they chose not to be part of that, eh? Yeah,
So,
because of commercial.
okay, so well, I guess the discussion wasn't necessarily about food, this was just as a,
Yeah, I'm sure.
I had to crib something from somewhere. Okay, so,
Can I just ask something? It says, what would we call it? The primary objective of NCCC.
well, that's next
we
time
need
as
to come
well.
up with
So
a name.
Yeah.
That's on the
So-
list of.
The agenda for next time.
it's on the agenda for next time.
Can't wait.
Okay, so
Nick,
I guess just coming back, so one of the things we just wanted to do was now that we've had this conversation, and for me it's been a really, really good conversation, because you've started to tease out some of the nuances in terms of what you want. Come back to these kind of assets which the leadership team identified as being the ones which they think are achievable. Is there any in there that people don't want us to look at for that objective, or is there any in there that people want us to add in to that initial objective, even if it is just to have a look at and ask a question around?
I think,
Haley?
not specifically, but as a principle, it would be quite good to know that there's been a lens put over it around, are there any of those that could potentially contribute to our strategic priorities? Like, do they have potential to build our resilience, say? And if that is, then that would be a reason why we might not consider putting them in.
Yep.
I guess I'd like to see a list of the dear residential land blocks that we have that are up for consideration.
Yep, exactly. Okay, we can bring that up at the next.
The thought process there was that they would have to be individually considered.
Yeah, I bet.
And there is that kind of, as I was giving the example of Pyramide, there's some things that you'd want to have a debate about prior to releasing them in, because once it's in, it needs to be, you need to allow the CCTO to do its thing.
nice to know what they are.
So you need to know what they are, and
Yeah.
then you can think about what the pitfalls are with
Yeah.
with
Yep.
them.
It's not putting it to a time where we need to make that decision. We
Yep.
just want to know what they are.
Yep,
Yep,
fair point.
And a little bit more understanding around the leasehold property,
yep,
because I think we have some that we've deemed strategic and some that are not. And that may be fluid in this day and age. Things are changing as things do.
yep.
What we believed was strategic, I don't know, is it still the same?
Yep, okay, so we can bring,
Yeah, I'm for.
we can have a little bit of a discussion in the next one around a couple of those assets as well, just to try and give an update as to what those assets are, what they look like, in terms of what we're thinking around on each one. And that will at least open up that conversation. But again, this is, I think I called them fishhooks, which isn't necessarily the right term, but it is to make sure that we're not handing something over to the CCTO to say, yep, you guys go ahead and you look at the best commercial opportunity that you can find in relation to this. Oh, but we forgot to tell you about that. And then, then all of a sudden we've got this clash of ideals between council and, so if we are going to sit there and say, look, yes, this land block is available for development, then we've had the conversation here to release it out for them to do whatever they deem as the right next stage.
So with our airport shares, are we going to be seriously considering doing something with that, or should it be taken out?
Well, again, we'll bring up asset by asset by asset. Part of the opportunity with the airport is not necessarily about selling.
No.
There might be an opportunity to buy, and you want someone to consider that. But the other thing is, actually, are we get a commercial entity, like your CCTO, to look at it and go, are we setting commercial targets for these guys that potentially could give us a dividend or other things into the future as well, right? So sometimes it's not necessarily about changing the asset itself, it's how we utilise and how we look at it. And at the moment, part of the challenge for council is, without being cruel, is that actually you don't look at your investment assets through an investment lens. They tend to be an asset of council. And so you don't maximise the opportunity that's there. We don't look at them as a portfolio and sit there and go, how does the return on this impact the return on that and the return on everything else, so that we get a best return that we can for council. And if you think of those two things on their own, they should elevate the income to council and the return on the assets up significantly that covers the cost of paying for itself and ultimately starts to grow some benefit, some other forms of benefit out there as well. So that's why when we talk about them as a portfolio, it's about, we don't look at these assets and ask the questions perhaps today that maybe we should be asking.
Yeah, I'm thinking the letter of expectation that we currently provide to HBEL, I think a letter from a CCTO would look quite different to the one that we are probably providing them with at the moment, and that's because they would be able to look at it in a different way and consider it differently from us.
Also the ability to reinvest or reutilise that dividend as opposed to getting it
Yeah, and again, it's,
absorbed.
so if we come back to the financial expectation we've got on the long-term plan, yes, this is where we want to try and get to. If you guys end up achieving up here, that's great, because we can start to grow resilience and start to do some other bits and pieces. Okay, so it doesn't sound like there's any extras that people want to add in, so that saves a little bit of work, which is good. Okay, last slide. So where are we now? We've got a workshop again in a couple of weeks' time. So that one will be looking at how do we get the right people into the CCTO. So as Chad raised the question earlier around elected members, independents, what's the blend? What skill set do we need to have if we're going to be an elected member sitting there? What skill set do we need to have if we're going to be an independent sitting there? What's our process of actually identifying and appointing people? So all of those things, because that'll come into some form of policy and other things that we have for council to go through that. What do we call it? And then we'll have a discussion on some of those other things that we've identified today, which may be a little bit of a discussion around some of those assets that we're talking about, just to dig a little bit deeper into sharing what those assets actually are, what they mean, and we can start to identify some of those hooks so that we can then make sure that we manage them or move them to the side or whatever the case may be as part of that process. By the end of August, what we'd like to do is the executive team, and probably supported by myself as well, distill what we get today into a first draft statement of expectation so that we can sit there and go, okay, here's a base document. And again, we'll have the opportunity to discuss that, but it gives us something. Distill what we get out of a couple of weeks' time into a draft appointment policy, and we can discuss that. We'll give you an update in terms of the other piece, which is the legal establishment, and where we are with each of those assets in terms of that. So we'll start to bring that in. And then in September, you'd look to combine those draft documents to kind of create the position description so that you can start that process for looking at how do we get board members for that entity. So that's a little bit of a run through. That's the last slide that I have. Any questions, comments?
Just
Yeah.
the naming process, does that involve our mana whenua partners at all?
Again, that's up to you.
I think we have the initial conversation at a high level, and then we can, involve our manakanaka.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Well, you did, Max.
Okay.
Does this kaupapa kind of tick their box in regards to the topics of interest that they identified in their last workshop? Because it might be just worth reminding them at the next workshop that this is open to them and someone's welcome to come so that they get that background information as well.
Yep, we can do that.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
That it?
I've got one, potentially getting down in the weeds a bit. If we considered into the future the likes of stranded overheads, when it all takes over, you might have different levels of service, different agreements. People, I'm thinking if you take over a whole bunch of land and you decide to mow it once every 6 months, as opposed to a level of service now that might be once a week sort of thing.
Yep.
So the assets will stay with council? So there shouldn't be
Yep, that
stranded...
asset will stay with council,
Yeah.
but the management of that asset,
Yeah, would be still
Stay with council.
the management, so the strategic the strategic decision-making would sit with your CCTO.
Yep.
But basically, if you consider the operational aspect of it, would still sit within council. Because otherwise we've got that duplication problem, because we have to keep it on our own balance sheet, particularly the land. Yeah.
Senior bigger building.
And we're certainly not recommending that any of our sports grounds or our sports or recs or anything like that transfer over into the CCTO at this point in time. It's only just purely those commercial assets.
Yeah, but we're also looking at land. Pyramid's probably a good example, sitting there as a grass field that gets mown to a certain standard and level.
Yeah, and that
Continue
operational
to
piece
get
doesn't
mowed
change.
to level
Yeah.
until something else happens.
No, it's just the value
That's right.
attached to it.
Apparently the cost of mow has just tripled.
That's why you want to develop it.
There we go, there might be an opportunity then.
Insuring it.
I think that's a really good point, though, for clarification for anyone, is just to have those bullet pointed in some kind of presentation or resource for us,
Yep.
so that it's there. And because I'm thinking, one of the things in my mind, and maybe it's just because I'm a little bit confused, is but understanding the work program in regards to what policies at council are going to need to be amended or reviewed in order to make the CCTO operational, and what policies do they need
Yep.
on day one as well, and understanding, that relationship. Oh,
So that's the slide here, which we went through earlier, but it's, yes, we've started talking about some initial identified assets.
yeah.
We've just sat here today and had a little bit of discussion. There hasn't been any kind of real objection to some of the ones that we're looking at. We'll go through in detail that process. We'll look at what we need to do to try and, I guess, up where we are today. But that will include looking at the delegations. It'll understand those hooks. It's all of those types of things to make sure that we can actually, because again, the last thing we want to do is sit there and give it to the CCTO and go, you've kind of got it,
Yeah.
but you've got to come back to us for every
Yeah,
question, and we don't want you to touch that, and don't do that. In which case, they go, well, we haven't actually got anything. So we're going to have to go through that process to make sure that things are, that we give them something they can use.
And that includes, that even the assets need to be bundled in such a way, in terms of that, you've already got the process of separation. Well, a lot of it is actually getting that and understanding the edges of it financially, and where does it begin and end, and so you actually can have something transparently obvious to the board to work with. Yeah, there's quite a bit in that. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Right, excellent. Good conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thanks.